When we hear the names ancient Greece and Rome, we imagine marble temples, soaring philosophies, and the birth of democracy. Athens is celebrated as the cradle of reason. Rome, as the empire of law and order. These civilizations are portrayed as the shining pillars upon which modern society stands. But behind the marble columns and gilded statues lies a truth they never wanted carved into history. Their freedom was built on chains. In Athens, the birthplace of democracy, a citizen's right to vote, to speak, to shape the destiny of the city was considered sacred. But only a small fraction of the population, wealthy men, were citizens. Women, foreigners, and most damning of all, the enslaved, were excluded. For every man raising his voice in the assembly, countless slaves toiled in silence, their backs bent in the fields, their hands raw in the mines, their bodies nothing more than tools of production. This was not democracy for all. It was democracy for the few, subsidized by human suffering. Rome was no different. The empire that claimed to bring civilization to the world relied on mass enslavement as the very foundation of its power. Every conquest added new chains. Men, women, and children marched in triumphal processions not as honored guests, but as trophies. Their identities were stripped away. They became property, objects to be bought, sold, and discarded. For the Roman elite, a life of leisure and intellectual pursuit was possible only because countless slaves worked unseen in kitchens, fields, and arenas. Even philosophy itself, the noble words of Aristotle, Cicero, Seneca, was steeped in hypocrisy. Aristotle argued that some people were slaves by nature, born to serve, as if destiny had chained them from birth. Seneca, who wrote eloquently on virtue and morality, owned slaves while preaching equality of the soul. These contradictions were not accidents. They were the very logic of civilizations desperate to justify their cruelty. And so, the illusion was crafted: freedom for the citizen, oppression for the slave. One man's liberty was another's prison. Athens could not shine without the silver mined by slaves in Laurion. Rome's grand spectacles, the gladiatorial games that drew roaring crowds, were drenched in the blood of enslaved men forced to fight for survival. Behind the laughter, behind the rhetoric of freedom, echoed the cries of those who would never taste it. The truth is unsettling. The civilizations that gave us democracy, philosophy, and law were also built on a system of mass human suffering. The marble gleamed white, but it was stained red. And this is the paradox of antiquity, a world that worshipped freedom while feeding on bondage. To understand slavery in Greece and Rome, we must step into the heart of its machinery, the system that turned human beings into commodities. It began in war. Every conquest, every fallen city, every defeated tribe was an opportunity. Soldiers who surrendered were shackled, families torn apart, and entire populations marched in chains. A battlefield victory meant not just land or glory, but fresh bodies for the markets. The slave market was a theater of humiliation. Stripped naked, examined like cattle, men were prodded for strength, women for beauty or fertility, children for obedience. The auctioneer's voice determined their fate. A single raised hand could sentence someone to a life in the mines, or to the perverse entertainment of a wealthy household. There was no identity, no dignity, just a price tag. The mines were death sentences disguised as labor. In Laurion, where Athens' wealth in silver was drawn, slaves toiled in suffocating tunnels so narrow they could barely crawl. Their lives were measured in months, not years. Rome's mines were no different. Black pits where men worked until their lungs collapsed and their bodies gave out. For the masters, profit was infinite. For the slaves, death was inevitable. Those not sent to mines found themselves in endless chains of domestic servitude. Cooking, cleaning, nursing, carrying water, fanning their masters in the heat of the Mediterranean sun. Some became teachers or scribes, but even the educated were no freer than the men in the fields. Their minds were owned, just as their bodies were. Punishment was constant, designed not only to discipline but to terrorize. A missed task, a sign of rebellion, even a hint of disobedience could mean beatings, mutilation, or crucifixion. The Romans perfected cruelty into a spectacle. Runaway slaves were branded on the forehead, their flesh forever marked as property. Some were forced into gladiatorial schools, where death became their profession. And yet, this machinery was invisible to those who benefited from it. The wealthy reclined in villas with marble courtyards, discussing philosophy and law, while their slaves quietly cleaned the floors, tended the gardens, and poured the wine. Children grew up thinking this was natural, that human beings could be owned just as easily as a chair or a plow. The system worked because it was everywhere, woven into the fabric of daily life. Slavery was not an exception but the rule, the hidden foundation of economies and empires. Greece and Rome celebrated freedom, but only for a chosen few. For the rest, life was a sentence without trial, chains without end. Chains can bind the body, but they cannot always crush the will. Across the centuries of Greece and Rome, countless slaves resisted, not always with weapons, but with courage, defiance, and small acts of rebellion that kept their humanity alive. Some resisted in silence. A broken tool here, a hidden loaf of bread there, whispers of forbidden songs sung in the dark. These were the weapons of the powerless, subtle and unseen. For many, resistance was survival itself, keeping culture alive, telling stories in secret, refusing to let the oppressor erase their identity. But at times, the resistance erupted into fire. Nowhere is this clearer than in Rome, where slavery was a volcano waiting to explode. The most famous eruption was led by a man whose name still haunts history, Spartacus. Spartacus was a Thracian, once a soldier, reduced to slavery and trained as a gladiator. Forced to fight for Roman amusement, he turned the arena into a battlefield of defiance. In 73 BCE, alongside 70 fellow gladiators armed with kitchen knives and stolen weapons, he broke free from the ludus, the gladiator school. What began as a desperate escape became a war of liberation. Tens of thousands of slaves flocked to his banner. They carved through Roman legions, burning estates, freeing captives, and challenging the empire itself. For nearly 2 years, Spartacus and his army of the oppressed defied the might of Rome. They dreamed not just of freedom, but of tearing down the very system that chained them. But the empire does not forgive rebellion. Rome responded with ruthless efficiency. After a series of brutal battles, Spartacus was defeated. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, a road lined with agony, bodies hanging as warnings to all who dared to dream of freedom. The message was clear: resist and die in torment. Yet Spartacus was not the only one. Revolts erupted across Sicily, where slaves rose against their masters in the Servile Wars, seizing fortresses and fighting like cornered beasts. In Greece, Helots, the enslaved population of Sparta, staged uprisings that shook the very foundations of their oppressors. Though most revolts were crushed, each one was a reminder: no chain is eternal, and no empire invincible. Even in defeat, these rebellions revealed something the masters feared most: that beneath the silence, the slaves carried within them the embers of rebellion, waiting for a spark. The Romans could crucify bodies, but they could never crucify the idea of freedom. And that idea, fragile and dangerous, would echo across the centuries. When we look back at Greece and Rome, we are told to see glory. Marble temples glowing in the sun, generals draped in laurel wreaths, philosophers shaping the destiny of thought. But beneath this glittering surface lies a truth history tries to forget. These civilizations were built not only on ideas, but on chains. Slavery was not a footnote to Greece and Rome, it was their backbone. The democracy of Athens rested on the shoulders of men and women who had no voice. Rome's empire, which stretched across continents, was sustained by millions of enslaved people who plowed its fields, built its aqueducts, and bled in its arenas. Without them, the marble would crumble, the granaries would empty, the empire itself would collapse. And yet, their names are lost, their stories silenced. What survives instead are the myths of freedom. We remember Pericles extolling democracy, Cicero defending liberty, Roman law laying the foundation of justice. But these lofty ideals were never meant for all. They were privileges for the few, justified by a system that dehumanized the many. It is the grand hypocrisy of antiquity, a world that spoke endlessly of freedom while feeding on bondage. And the echoes did not end when the empires fell. The logic of slavery, the belief that some lives can be owned, that some people are destined to serve, slithered forward into the future. From the plantations of the Americas to the chains of colonialism, the same justifications resurfaced, dressed in new language but rooted in the same ancient poison. Aristotle's notion of natural slaves was quoted centuries later to defend human bondage. Rome's system of mass enslavement became the template for new empires. Even today, the shadows linger. The language of liberty is still too often paired with hidden exploitation. The promise of freedom is still denied to many. The ghosts of the enslaved of Greece and Rome walk silently through the corridors of history, reminding us that civilization's brilliance can mask its deepest cruelty. So when we admire the ruins of the Parthenon or the Colosseum, we must remember, these stones were raised by hands that were not free. The grandeur of antiquity was not just built by philosophers and generals. It was built by men, women, and children who lived and died in chains. Their names are gone, but their suffering carved itself into history's foundations. The legacy of Greece and Rome is not just democracy, law, and philosophy. It is also the lesson that freedom proclaimed by the few means nothing if it rests upon the suffering of the many. And until we confront that paradox, we are still living in the shadow of their chains.